Everyone in Redwood Valley laughed when they heard that 18-year-old Maya Carter had inherited the old Carter Junkyard, a useless wasteland of rusted cars and broken metal that had sat abandoned for decades. But none of them imagined that the girl they pitted would soon turn that same scrap heap into something that would change the town forever. The sound of the screen door slamming behind her was soft, almost insignificant, yet to Maya it felt like the closing of an entire chapter of her life. The early October air was cold and dry, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from nearby houses, but she barely noticed it as she stood at the edge of the gravel driveway staring at the dusty road ahead. In one hand she held a small backpack that contained everything she owned: 2 shirts, a pair of worn jeans, a pocket knife, and a bundle of wrinkled bills totaling just $21. In the other hand, she clutched a folded piece of paper her father had pressed into her palm only minutes earlier. It was a property deed, yellowed with age and creased along the edges, belonging to the only thing he had left her from her grandfather's estate. "You're 18 now," he had said without meeting her eyes, his voice tired and flat, as if the conversation were nothing more than a chore that had to be finished. "Tom, you learned to make your own way." There was no anger in his words, no cruelty even, just a kind of cold practicality that made them feel heavier than any insult could have. The truth was simple. Times were hard, money was tight, and in his mind one less person in the house meant one less burden to carry. Maya had wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but the look on his face told her it would change nothing. So she simply nodded, took the deed, and stepped outside. She did not look back at the house where she had lived her entire life. Looking back, she decided, was a luxury she could not afford. The walk into town took nearly an hour, and the entire time she repeated the same inventory in her head like a quiet chant meant to keep panic away. $21, a backpack, a pocket knife, and the deed to a place she had never seen. When she finally pushed open the door of Dalton's hardware store, the bell above it gave a cheerful ring that felt strangely out of place compared to the knot tightening in her stomach. The store smelled of oil, sawdust, and leather gloves, and behind the counter stood Mr. Dalton himself, a thick-shouldered man with silver hair and spectacles perched low on his nose. He looked up as she approached and offered a polite nod. "Afternoon, Maya," he said. "What can I help you with?" Instead of answering immediately, she placed the folded deed on the counter and slid it toward him. "Do you know anything about this land?" she asked quietly. Mr. Dalton adjusted his glasses and leaned closer, studying the document with a slow frown that deepened as he read. After a moment he sighed and leaned back. "Well," he said, tapping the paper with a thick finger, "that there is the Carter scrap lot. Your grandfather used to run it years ago before it shut down." Maya waited, sensing there was more. Mr. Dalton rubbed his chin. "Truth is, kid, that place ain't worth much of anything anymore. 20 acres of rusted cars, busted engines, and weeds taller than a man's shoulders." He pushed the deed back toward her. "Most folks around here call it Deadman's lot." Maya felt the weight of his words settle over her like a heavy coat. "So it's useless?" she asked. Mr. Dalton hesitated before answering, which somehow made his response even clearer. "If you ask me," he said slowly, "you'd be better off selling the deed and using the money for a bus ticket out of Redwood Valley. City's got more opportunities than an old junk pile." Maya looked down at the small stack of bills in her hand. $21 would barely buy lunch, let alone a new life in the city. And even if she managed to get there, she would arrive with nothing. No job, no home, no plan. At least the junkyard was hers. She folded the deed carefully and slipped it back into her pocket before lifting her eyes to meet Mr. Dalton's gaze again. "I need a shovel," she said, "and a hammer, and the cheapest pair of work gloves you have." Mr. Dalton blinked in surprise. "You're serious about this?" Maya nodded once. For a moment he studied her face as if trying to decide whether she was brave or simply foolish. Finally he turned around and began gathering the tools she requested. When he placed them on the counter, he shook his head slightly. "That junkyard's been sitting empty for 30 years, he said. "Most folks figure it's good for nothing but scrap metal and rattlesnakes." Maya picked up the gloves and pulled them on slowly, the rough fabric stiff against her fingers. "Then I guess I'll start with the scrap," she replied. A few hours later she found herself walking down the dusty county road that led to the Carter property, the late afternoon sun hanging low behind the hills as the wind rustled through dry grass along the roadside. When she finally reached the rusted chain gate marking the entrance, she stopped and stared at the land beyond it. Mr. Dalton had not exaggerated. The place looked like a graveyard of machines. Rows of broken vehicles stretched across the field, their paint faded and their windows shattered. Engines lay scattered across the ground like discarded skeletons, and thick weeds pushed through cracked metal frames, as if nature itself were trying to reclaim the entire place. For a moment doubt crept into her mind, whispering that everyone in town was right. Maybe the junkyard really was worthless. Maybe she had just traded the safety of her old life for a pile of rust. But then Maya stepped through the gate and walked deeper into the yard, studying the tangled rows of metal with a careful eye. She noticed things others might overlook: intact tires, salvageable engines, wires that still glinted with copper beneath layers of dirt. What everyone else saw as garbage began to look different the longer she stared at it. Not junk, not useless, just pieces waiting to be used again. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the rusted vehicles, Maya Carter realized something important. She had arrived with almost nothing in the world. But standing in the middle of that forgotten junkyard, surrounded by hundreds of broken machines, she might actually be standing on the beginning of everything. What the people of Redwood Valley didn't understand was that a junkyard is only useless to someone who doesn't know how to look at it. And during the first difficult weeks on Deadman's lot, Maya Carter slowly learned how to see value where everyone else saw nothing but rust. The first nights were the hardest. With no house on the property, she slept inside the cab of an abandoned delivery truck half buried in weeds, using torn seat cushions as a mattress and her backpack as a pillow. The cold October wind slipped through the broken windows, and some nights she barely slept at all. But every morning she forced herself up before sunrise and began working again. The junkyard looked like chaos at first: twisted frames, shattered glass, rusted engines scattered across 20 acres. But Maya started small. She cleared weeds away from the nearest vehicles and began sorting everything she could remove. Steel in one pile, aluminum in another, copper wiring and electronics in a bucket she carried from car to car. The work was slow and exhausting, and her hands blistered quickly despite the gloves she bought in town. But the piles began to grow. Beneath the rust, she discovered parts that still had value: radiators, alternators, brake systems, even intact transmissions. Once a week a scrap buyer passed through Redwood Valley with a flatbed truck, and the first time he paid her $80 for a small load of metal, Maya stood there staring at the money in disbelief. It was the first real proof that the junkyard wasn't worthless after all. Encouraged, she worked harder. During the day she stripped vehicles piece by piece, and at night she studied the parts she removed, slowly teaching herself how engines and machines fit together. Within a few weeks, she could dismantle a car twice as fast as when she started. She also began organizing the yard, clearing a wide path through the rows of scrap so she could move equipment more easily. Using old boards and a sheet of corrugated metal she found buried under weeds, she even built herself a small shelter beside the delivery truck to store tools and keep dry during the rain. By late November, the mornings were covered with frost, but Maya had made an important discovery hidden among the rusting vehicles. Many of the parts she found didn't need to be scrapped at all. Some could still be used. One afternoon, while taking apart an old pickup truck, she removed an alternator that looked surprisingly intact. Curious, she carried it into town and showed it to the mechanic at Garrett's Auto Repair. The man turned the part in his hands, then looked up at her with raised eyebrows. "Where'd you find this?" he asked. "Old Carter Junkyard," Maya answered. He nodded slowly. "I'll give you $40 for it." That single sale changed everything. Maya returned to the junkyard with a new plan. Instead of selling everything as scrap, she began carefully searching for reusable components: mirrors, batteries, door handles, starter motors, radiators, anything mechanics might need. Within weeks, she had several crates filled with working parts. She even nailed a small hand-painted sign to the gate made from an old license plate: Carter Salvage, used parts. At first, most people in Redwood Valley ignored it. A few laughed when they heard about the girl trying to run a business from a pile of junk. But slowly, curiosity brought the first customers. A farmer looking for a replacement taillight, a mechanic searching for a radiator fan. Each time someone arrived, Maya walked them through the yard and found exactly what they needed among the carefully sorted rows of metal. And by the time winter crept over Redwood Valley, the place that had once looked like a worthless scrap heap had quietly begun turning into something far more valuable than anyone in town had expected. By the time winter settled over Redwood Valley, most people in town still believed Maya Carter was just a stubborn girl living alone in a useless junkyard. But everything changed the night a violent snowstorm swept across the valley and proved just how wrong they had been. The storm arrived without warning, carried by freezing winds that turned the sky white and buried the roads under heavy snow within hours. Cars slid off the highway, delivery trucks broke down, and the few repair shops in town quickly ran out of spare parts needed to keep vehicles running. By the second day the town was struggling. Farmers couldn't move supplies, emergency crews were short on working vehicles, and mechanics were desperate for parts that wouldn't arrive until the roads reopened. That was when someone mentioned the Carter Junkyard. At first the idea sounded ridiculous. The same place everyone had mocked for months was suddenly the only place nearby, filled with spare vehicle parts. But the situation left them with few options. One by one, people began making the snowy trip out to Deadman's lot. When they arrived, what they found stunned them. The junkyard that had once been a chaotic pile of rust was now carefully organized into rows of vehicles and shelves of salvaged components. Engines were stacked neatly under a covered area, tires were arranged by size, and crates of working parts sat labeled near the gate. In the middle of it all stood Maya, bundled in a heavy coat, her hands blackened with grease as she worked beneath the hood of an old pickup truck. She looked up in surprise when the first mechanic approached her asking for a starter motor. Without hesitation, she led him to a crate and handed him exactly what he needed. Word spread quickly after that. Throughout the storm, people arrived looking for batteries, belts, radiators, and alternators, and each time Maya searched through the rows of vehicles and found the part they needed. She even used the old tow truck she had repaired weeks earlier to help pull stranded vehicles from the snowy roads. The same people who had once laughed at the idea of her living in the junkyard now stood quietly watching as she kept their vehicles running when no one else could. One afternoon, Mr. Dalton himself arrived, his delivery truck stalled and half buried in snow. He stepped out slowly and stared across the yard in disbelief. The place he remembered as an abandoned scrap heap now looked like a working salvage operation. Maya found the part his truck needed within minutes and helped him install it. When the engine roared back to life, Mr. Dalton stood there for a moment shaking his head. "All this," he said quietly, glancing around the yard. "You built it yourself?" Maya wiped grease from her hands and shrugged slightly. "It was all here already," she said. "I just put it back to use." The storm finally passed 3 days later, leaving Redwood Valley buried in snow but slowly returning to normal. Yet something in the town had changed. The story of the girl who turned a worthless junkyard into the place that kept the town running spread quickly. Mechanics began coming directly to Carter Salvage when they needed parts. Farmers stopped by looking for equipment repairs. Even the scrap buyers started offering higher prices for the organized metal Maya sold in bulk. By spring, the junkyard had become something entirely different from what it once was. New signs stood at the entrance. Rows of salvaged parts filled long wooden shelves. The old delivery truck had been replaced by a small office Maya built from reclaimed materials. People no longer called the property Deadman's lot. They called it Carter Salvage Yard. Sometimes in the evenings, after the last customer had left and the sun dipped behind the hills, Maya would stand at the gate and look across the yard that had once seemed so hopeless. Rows of rusted vehicles still filled the land, but now she saw them differently. Not as junk, and not as something broken beyond repair. They were simply pieces waiting to become useful. Again, just like the life she had started the day she walked away from her father's house with $21 and a folded piece of paper. The town had believed she inherited a useless junkyard. But what Maya Carter really inherited was an opportunity no one else had the patience to see.